When I first moved to Austin, Texas back in the mid-90s, I didn't exactly have an impressive resume. Extensive experience in food service and majoring in English only takes you so far, as in not very. It's not that I didn't have ambitions, it's just that they weren't very practical ambitions. When I first moved to Austin, I was much more interested in writing and literature and the arts than having a sensible career. As a result, I ended up taking a number of temporary office jobs in the first few years while I worked on a couple of novels. And I eventually landed an entry-level office job with the state for a while because I primarily wanted an undemanding job that wouldn't interfere with my other interests. Not surprisingly then, those were lean years financially, although creatively rewarding and tremendously valuable from a people-watching perspective. I don't mean superficial people-watching. I mean having the opportunity to study the psychologies of a wide range of individuals, the very successful, the very unsuccessful, and everyone in between. I also made some great friends in the process, and in this video, I want to tell you about one of those friends and what I learned from him. But before I start, I want to underscore that I'm not judging anyone here in the least. I love that idea or philosophy that Confucius had, that whether you see someone acting exemplary or acting poorly, your response should be the same. Go somewhere quiet and examine your own life. So one of the first temp jobs I had was with what was then the Texas Department of Human Services, processing school lunch reimbursement claims. I worked in a very small office of about 9 or 10 people. One of the state employees I worked with was Albert. Albert was Hispanic, about 15 years older than I was, in his early to mid-40s, and originally from Houston, with what I would learn were some formative childhood memories or experiences involving racism. He was also an artist, mostly a painter, not an aspiring artist, and definitely not commercially successful, but a true artist nonetheless, with talent and ideas and the ability to tap into that inner source where all real art comes from. And he also had his share of character flaws. He was financially strapped and, as a result, frequently stressed and frustrated. As a full-time employee, he wasn't making much more than I was as a temp. We hit it off pretty quickly. We both shared a love of the arts, and we appreciated each other's humor. And we were both doing a job that was on the first rung of the state bureaucratic career ladder, and neither one of us had the interest to want to climb much higher. We had cubicles tucked way in the back of that small office where we worked. Albert was on one side of a cubicle wall, and I was on the other. He also had a small radio turned low on his side that he listened to all day, which was fine with me because I liked the station too. It was a good mix of singer-songwriter type music, blues, mellow classic rock, and local Austin stuff, and every once in a while some Bob Marley. Now sometimes when certain songs would come on, he would refer to me as Blondie, which he and I found amusing. He wasn't referring to the band Blondie, but to the movie The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Blondie is what Eli Wallach's character, aka the Ugly, calls Clint Eastwood's bounty hunter character, aka the Good. So here's how it would work. Every time the radio station would play Lowrider by War, I would hear Albert say in a voice just loud enough for me to hear, "Blondie, this is the music of my peoples." But there was another song that the station played a lot at the time too, California Stars by Billy Bragg and Wilco.
I'd like to dream my troubles all the way out of California Stars.
They had collaborated on an album called Mermaid Avenue back in 1998, based on a number of lyrics the late Woody Guthrie had written in his lifetime without ever setting them to music. One of the songs that got a fair amount of play from the album, at least on the station Albert and I regularly listened to, was called California Stars. Now, when this song would play, I would hear Albert's low voice again, this time saying, "Blondie, this is the music of your peoples." Albert was smart and funny and creative, and I truly believe sufficiently imaginative to have transformed himself and taken his life to the next level. He was also a man of appetites. I remember that he used to bring in the Austin American Statesman every morning, and on the day of the week that the grocery store ads ran, I'd hear him commenting about and salivating over the steaks. And he loved smoking cigars. He also loved other things and had an on-again, off-again girlfriend considerably younger than himself. Another thing I remember about him is that he loved a cold room. Even though he was financially strapped, the one luxury he afforded himself was keeping the temperature in his apartment down in the 60s. His guests would always complain, he would tell me, but he never raised the thermostat. Instead, he just passed out blankets. I didn't see a lot of his work, his real work, the paintings he created, not the paperwork he and I processed. But one day he did bring in a self-portrait he'd recently painted. I can't remember all the details now, but there was a brilliant blue backdrop, a number of stars, a tortilla that represented his culture, the Virgin of Guadalupe, or the Virgen de Guadalupe, and in the center of it all was his large, bright, yellow, sun-like face wearing sunglasses and smoking a cigar. It was perfect, a far more accurate portrait than any mirror photograph could ever capture. That was the real Albert, the larger-than-life, triumphant Albert. Unfortunately, it wasn't the only Albert. There was also the middle-aged, frustrated, frequently self-defeated Albert. I ended up getting a different position with the agency in a different office, one rung higher on the bureaucratic ladder, and where I would plateau and quit the state altogether about 6 months later. We stayed in contact via email a bit after I left, but eventually we drifted apart. A few years later, I tried searching for him on the internet, but could only find one reference to him initially, an art alumni exhibition at the University of Texas where his work was included in memoriam. I would later find an online obituary. I don't know how he died, but I would later learn that he died the day after his 50th birthday. He'd been diagnosed with diabetes shortly before I left the office where we worked together, but he also had some anger issues and, of course, was frequently stressed and frustrated, so I'm not entirely sure he died of natural causes. But one thing that always stayed with me, even before I learned of his death, was how he started signing his letters toward the end. And by letters, I mean emails. And by emails, I mean all emails, even the official work-related ones. Whether it was the daily joke email that got circulated around the office, or whether it was official department correspondence, there below all of Albert's contact information in quotations was the phrase, "The brown buffalo will survive." It was wonderful, vintage Albert, but, especially in hindsight, heartbreaking as well. We have to be so careful what imagery we identify with, or allow ourselves to identify with. Yes, I get that he felt defeated and downtrodden, that life felt like a struggle and that his glory days had passed, and that he felt a parallel to the American bison who once roamed the Great Plains by the millions, but who were systematically wiped out for both quick profits and as a way to starve out the indigenous cultures in the way of progress and economic power. But what hope is there? How likely are you going to find a way to turn things around when you so clearly identify with the losing side of a tragic story? If mere survival is your only hope, if the best you can dream of is that you simply get through another day, if the story you tell yourself about yourself is that it's only a matter of time before you're destroyed, you have no hope. I really do believe that our lives are the result of the stories that we tell and believe about ourselves. That doesn't mean that if you simply believe great things about yourself, nothing bad will ever happen to you. And sometimes, of course, survival is itself a triumphant and defiant act. But survival should be a single event or a temporary state, not a way of life. We must consciously choose our stories and metaphors and self-conceptions rather than willingly going along with the self-defeating ones that occur to us by default. Albert saw himself as a brown buffalo? Fine, but he should have signed his emails with a gusto of which he was not in short supply. The brown buffalo will thrive. Instead of unconsciously calling up images of greedy buffalo hunters slaughtering millions upon millions of these great beasts, he instead could have painted panoramas of lush Midwestern grasslands, or included in his next self-portrait healthy, young, strong bison calves. At one point in my early years in Austin, I lived in an apartment complex next door to a large new church that was being built, St. Albert the Great. I laughed when I first learned what the name was, and still, every time I drive by it, I'm reminded of my friend. We should all have churches named after our true potential. Who knows? Maybe we do. Maybe if we set aside our self-defeating stories and consciously look for them, we'll find more and more of these reminders of who we really are, of who we really can be.